Other conquests radiated outward from Peruvian and Mexican centers. The Caribbean Crucible. The Caribbean experience served Spain as a model for its actions elsewhere in the Americas. After Columbus's first transatlantic voyage in 1492, a return expedition in the next year re-established colony on the island of Santo Domingo, or Hispaniola. Figure 19.2. I said re-established. In the next year, established a colony on the island of Santo Domingo, or Hispaniola. Figure 19.2. From Spain, expeditions carried out new explorations and conquests. Puerto Rico, 1508, and Cuba, 1511, fell under Spanish control, and by 1513, settlements existed in Panama and on the northern coast of South America, map 19.1. In the Caribbean, the agricultural Taino people of the islands provided enough surplus labor to make their distribution to individual Spaniards feasible, and thus began what would become the encomienda, or grant of indigenous people to individual Spaniards in a kind of serfdom. The holder of an encomienda or encomendero was able to use the people as workers or to tax them. Gold hunting, slaving, and European diseases rapidly depopulated the islands, and within 2 decades little was left there to hold Spanish attention. A few strongly fortified ports, such as Havana, San Juan, and Santo Domingo, guarded Spain's commercial lifeline, but on the whole, the Caribbean became a colonial backwater for the next 2 centuries, until sugar and slaves became the basis of its resurgence. In the 40 years between the first voyage of Columbus and the conquest of Mexico, the Caribbean served as a testing ground. The Spaniards established Iberian-style cities that had adapt them to American realities. Hurricanes and the native people's resistance caused many towns to be moved or abandoned, but the New World also provided opportunities to implant new ideas and forms. Unlike cities in Europe, Spanish-American cities usually were laid out according to grid plan or checkerboard form, with the town hall, major church, and governor's palace in the central plaza, figure 19.3. Spaniards applied Roman models and rational town planning ideas to the new situation. Conquest came to imply settlement. To rule, Spain created administrative institutions, the government, the Treasury Office, and the Royal Court of Appeals staffed by professional magistrates. Spanish legalism was part of the institutional transfer. Notaries accompanied new expeditions, and a body of laws were developed, based on those of Castile and augmented by American experience. The church, represented at first by individual priests and then by missionaries such as Dominicans, participated in the enterprise. By 1530, a cathedral was built on Hispaniola, and a university soon followed. Rumors and hopes simulated immigration from Castile, which claimed control of the new lands, but also from the other Iberian kingdoms, and by the 1510s, the immigrants included larger numbers of Spanish women. Also, Spanish and Italian merchants began to import African slaves to work on the few sugar plantations that operated on the islands. The arrival of both Spanish women and African slaves marked a shift from an area of conquest to one of settlement. The gold hunting phase had given out in the islands by the 1520s and was replaced by the establishment of ranches and sugar plantations. The adventurous, the disappointed, and the greedy repeated the pattern as expeditions spun off in new directions. Depopulation of the Tainos led to slaving on other islands, and in 30 years or so, most of the indigenous population had died or been killed off. The people of the Lesser Antilles, or Carbis, spelled Caribs, whom the Spaniards accused of cannibalism and who were thus always subject to enslavement, held out longer because their islands were less attractive to European settlement. To meet the labor needs of the island, African slaves were imported. As early as 1510, the mistreatment and destruction of the American Indians led to attempts by clerics and royal administrators to end the worst abuse. The activities of men such as Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas, 1484 to 1566, figure 19.4, a conquistador turned priest, initiated the struggle for justice. Expeditions leaped from island to island, where the native peoples and cultures were more resilient. Their impact on the societies that emerged was greater than that in the Caribbean, but the process of contact was similar. By the time of the conquest of Mexico in the 1520s and Peru in the 1530s, all the elements of the colonial system of Latin America were in place. Even in Brazil, which the Portuguese began to exploit after 1500, a period of bartering with the Native Americans was slowly replaced by increasing royal control and development of a sugar plantation economy. There, as in the Caribbean, resistance and subsequent depopulation of the native peoples led to the importation of African laborers. The paths of conquest. No other race can be found that can penetrate through such rugged lands, such dense forests, such great mountains and deserts, and cross such broad rivers as the Spaniards have done, solely by the valor of their persons and forcefulness of their breed. These words, written by Pedro Cieza de Leon, Cieza is spelled Cieza, one of the conquistadors of Peru, underline the Spaniards' pride in their accomplishments. In less than a century, a large portion of 2 continents and islands of an inland sea, inhabited by millions of people, was brought under Spanish control. Expeditions, usually comprising 50 to 500 men, provided the spearhead of conquest, and in their wake followed the women, missionaries, administrators, and artisans, who began to form civil society. The conquest was not a unified movement, rather to form civil society. That's the end of the sentence. The conquest was not a unified movement, but rather a series of individual initiatives that usually operated with governmental approval. The conquest of the Americas was 2-pronged. One prong was directed toward Mexico, the other was aimed at South America. We can use the well-documented campaign in Mexico as an example of a conquest. In 1519, Hernan Cortes, an educated man with considerable ability as a leader, led an expedition of 600 men to the coast of Mexico. After hearing rumors of a great kingdom in the interior, he began to strike inland. Pitched battles were brought with towns subject to the Aztec Empire, but after gaining these victories, Cortes was able to enlist the defeated people's support against their overlords. With the help of the Indian allies, Cortes eventually reached the great Aztec island capital of Tenochtitlan. By a combination of deception, boldness, ruthlessness, and luck, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II was captured and killed. Cortes and his followers were forced to flee the Aztec capital and retreat toward the coast, but with the help of the Aztecs, traditional enemies, they cut off and besieged Tenochtitlan. Although the Aztec Confederacy put up a stiff resistance, disease, starvation, and battle brought the city down in 1521. Tenochtitlan was replaced by Mexico City. The Aztec poets later remembered, "We are crushed to the ground. We lie in ruins. There is nothing but grief and suffering in Mexico and Tlatelolco, where once we saw beauty and valor." By 1535, most of central Mexico and its network of towns and its dense agricultural populations had been brought under Spanish control as the Kingdom of New Spain. From there, the Spanish pushed their conquests southward into Central America and northward into the area of nomadic peoples of north-central Mexico. The second trajectory of conquest led from the The second trajectory of conquest led from the Caribbean outposts to the coast of northern South America and Panama. From Panama, the Spaniards followed rumors of a rich kingdom to the south. In 1532, after a false start, Francisco Pizarro led his men to the conquest of the Inca Empire, which was already weakened by a long civil war. Once again, using skill and audacity, fewer than 200 Spaniards and their native Indian allies brought down a great empire. The Inca capital of Cusco, high in the Andes, fell in 1533, but the Spanish decided to build their major city, Lima, closer to the coast. By 1540, most of Peru was under Spanish control, although an active resistance continued in remote areas for another 30 years. From the conquests of densely populated areas such as Mexico and Peru, where there were surpluses of food and potential laborers, Spanish expeditions spread out in search of further riches and strange peoples. They penetrated the zones of sedentary and nomadic peoples, who often offered stiff resistance. From 1540 to 1542, one of the most famous expeditions, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, searching for mythical cities of gold, penetrated what is now the southwestern United States as far as Kansas. At the end of the Americas, Pedro de Valdivia conquered the tenacious Araucanians, spelled Araucanians, of central Chile, and set up the city of Santiago in 1541. Although the Araucanians, that's how I'm going to pronounce it from now on, continued to fight long after. Buenos Aires, spelled A-I-R-E-S. I'm going to say Aires, even though that doesn't seem right. In the southern part of the continent, founded by an expedition from Spain in 1536, was abandoned because of resistance and was not founded until 1580. Other expeditions penetrated the Amazon basin and explored the tropical forests of Central and South America during these years, but there was little there to attract permanent settlement to those areas. By 1570, there were 192 Spanish cities and towns throughout the Americas, one-third of which in Mexico and Central America. The conquerors. The Spanish captains led by force of will and personal power. God in heaven, the king in Spain, and me here, was the motto of one captain, and sometimes absolute power could lead to tyranny. The crown received one-fifth of all treasure. Men signed up on a shares basis. Those who brought horse or who had special skills might get double shares. Rewards were made according to the contact, and premiums were paid for special service and valor. There was a tendency for leaders to reward their friends, relatives, and men from their home province more liberally than others, so that after each conquest, there was always a group of unhappy and dissatisfied conquerors ready to organize a new expedition. As one observer put it, if each man was given the governorship, it would not be enough. Few of the conquerors were professional soldiers. They represented all walks of Spanish life, including a scattering of gentlemen and sometimes even former slaves in freedom. Some of the later expeditions included a few Spanish women, such as Inez Suarez, the heroine of the conquest of Chile, but such cases were rare. In general, the conquerors were men on the make, hoping to better themselves and serve God by converting the heathen at the same time. Always on the lookout for treasure, most conquerors were satisfied by encomiendas. The adventurous men, many of humble origins, came to see themselves as a new nobility entitled to dominion over a new peasantry, the American Indians. The reasons for Spanish success were varied. Horses, firearms, and more general steel weapons gave them a great advantage over the stone technology of the native peoples. This technological edge, combined with effective and ruthless leadership, produced remarkable results. Epidemic disease also proved to be a silent ally of the Europeans. Finally, internal divisions and rivalries within American Indian empires and their high levels of centralization made the great civilizations particularly vulnerable. It is no accident that the peoples who offered the stiffest and most continuous resistance were usually the mobile, tough, nomadic tribes rather than the centralized states of sedentary peasants. By about 1750, the age of the conquest was coming to a close. Bureaucrats, merchants, and colonists replaced the generation of the conquerors as institutions of government and economy were created. The transition was not easy. In Peru, a civil war erupted in the 1540s, and in Mexico there were grumblings from the old followers of Cortés. But the establishment of viceroys in the two main colonies and in the creation of law courts in the main centers signaled that Spanish America had become a colony rather than a conquest. Conquest and morality. Conquest involved violence, domination, and theft. The Spanish conquest of the Americas created a series of important philosophical and moral questions for Europeans. Mancio Serra was not alone in questioning the conquest. Theologians and lawyers asked, who are the Indians? Were they fully human? Was it proper to convert them to Christianity? Could conversion by force or the conquest of their lands be justified? Driven by greed, many of the conquistadors argued that conquest was necessary to spread the gospel and that control of Indian labor was essential for Spain's rule. In 1548, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, a noted Spanish scholar, based his arguments on Aristotle, published a book claiming that the conquest was fully justified. The Spaniards had come to free the Indians from their unjust lords and to bring the light of salvation. Most importantly, he argued that the Indians were not fully human, and some peoples were born to serve. In 1550, the Spanish king suspended all further conquests and convoked a special commission in Valladolid, spelled Valladolid, to hear arguments for and against this position. Father Bartolome, I think it's Bartholomew, even though it's spelled Bartolome with a little asterisk. I'm going to say Bartolome. Anyway, Father Bartolome de las Casas, former conqueror and encomendero, Dominican priest, bishop of Chiapas, untiring defender of the Indians and critic of Spanish brutality, presented the contrary opinion against Sepulveda. Las Casas had long experience in the West Indies, and he believed that the inhabitants were rational people who, unlike the Muslims, had never done harm to Christians. Thus, the conquest of their lands was unjustified. The Indians had many admirable customs and accomplishments, he said. He argued that the Indians are our brothers, and Christ has given his life for them. Spanish rule in order to spread the Christian faith was justified, but conversion should take place only by peaceful means. The result of the debate was mixed. The Crown had reasons to back Las Casas against the dangerous ambitions of the Spanish conquerors. Sepulveda's book was censored, but the conquest nevertheless continued. Although some of the worst abuses were moderated, in reality the great period of conquest was all over by the 1570s. It was too little, too late. Still, the Spanish government's concern with the legality and morality of its actions and the willingness of Spaniards such as Las Casas to speak out against abuses are also part of the story. The interests of many other conquerors and officials, however, ran in the opposite direction. The destruction and transformation of indigenous societies. The various American peoples responded in many different ways to the invasion of their lands and the transformation of their societies. All of them suffered a severe decline of population, a demographic catastrophe. On the main islands of the Caribbean, the indigenous population had nearly disappeared by 1540 as a result of slaving, mistreatment, and disease. In Peru, a similar process brought a loss more from 10 million to 1.5 million between 1530 and 1590. Elsewhere in the Americas, a similar but less well-documented process took place. Smallpox, influenza, and measles wreaked havoc on the American Indian population, which had developed no immunities against these diseases. In central Mexico, war, destruction, and above all, disease brought the population from an estimated 25 million in 1519 to less than 2 million in 1580. The decline was matched by the rapid increase in European livestock, cattle, sheep, and horses that flourished on newly created Spanish farms or in previously unusable lands. In a shocking way, European livestock were replacing an indigenous population on the land. Figure 19.5. Although epidemic was the major cause of depopulation, the conquest and the weakening of indigenous societies contributed to the losses. Population declines in this size disrupted the native societies in many ways. For example, in central Mexico, the contraction of the indigenous populations led the Spanish to concentrate the remaining population in fewer towns, and this led in turn to the seizure of former communal farming lands by Spanish landowners. Demographic collapse made maintaining traditional social and economic structures very difficult. Exploitation of the Indians. The Spaniards did not interfere with aspects of Native American life that served colonial goals, or at least did not openly conflict with Spanish authority or religion. Thus, in Mexico and Peru, while old religions and its priestly class were eliminated, the traditional indigenous nobility remained in place, supported by Spanish authority, as middlemen between the tax and labor demands of new rulers and the majority of the population. The enslavement of Indians, a term that Spaniards applied to all the native peoples of the Americas, except those taken in war, was prohibited by the mid-16th century in most of Spanish America. Instead, different forms of labor or taxation were imposed. At first, encomiendas were given to the individual conquerors of a region. The holders of these grants were able to use their dependents as workers and servants or to tax them, whereas commoners who had owed tribute or labored to the state in the Inca and Aztec empires, the new demands were arbitrary, often excessive, and usually without the reciprocal obligation and protection characteristic of the indigenous societies. In general, the encomiendas were destructive. The Spanish crown, unwillingly to see a new nobility arise in the New World among the conquerors with their grants of Indian serfs, moved to end the institution in the 1540s. The crown limited the inheritable of encomiendas and prohibited the right to demand certain kinds of labor from the Indians. Although encomiendas continued to exist in marginal regions at the fringes of the empire, they were all but gone by the 1620s in the central areas of Mexico and Peru. Colonists increasingly sought grants of land rather than Indians as the basis of wealth. Meanwhile, the colonial government increasingly extracted labor and taxes from the native peoples. In many places, communities were required to send groups of laborers to work on state projects such as church construction or road building, or in labor gangs for mining or agriculture. This forced labor, called the Mida in Peru, where it was adapted from indigenous precedents, mobilized thousands of workers for the mines and on other projects. Although they were paid a wage for this work, there were many abuses of the system by the local officials, and community labor requirements were often disruptive and destructive. By the 17th century, many Indians left their villages to avoid the labor and tax obligations preferring instead to work for Spanish landowners or to seek employment in the cities. This process eventually led to the growth of a wage labor system in which native peoples no longer resident in their villages worked for wages on Spanish-owned mines and farms or in the cities. In the wake of this disruption, Native American culture also demonstrated great resiliency in the face of Spanish institutions and forms, adapting and modifying them to indigenous ways. In Peru and Mexico, Native peoples learned to use the Spanish legal system and the law court so that litigation became a way of life. At the local level, many aspects of indigenous life remained, and Native Americans proved to be selective in their adaptation of European foods, technology, and culture. Colonial economies and governments. Spanish America was an agrarian society in which perhaps 80% of the population lived and worked on the land. Yet, in terms of America's importance to Spain, mining was the essential activity and basis of Spain's role in the Indies. It was precious metals that first began to fit Latin America into the developing world economy. Although the booty of conquest provided some wealth, most of the precious metals sent across the Atlantic came from the post-conquest mining industry. Gold was found in the Caribbean, Colombia, and Chile, but it was silver, far more than gold, that formed the basis of Spain's wealth in America. The silver heart of empire. The major silver discoveries were made in Mexico and Peru between 1545 and 1565. Great silver mining towns developed. Potosi in Upper Peru, in what is now Bolivia, was the largest mine of all, producing about 80% of all the Peruvian silver. In the early 17th century, more than 160,000 people lived and worked in the town and its mine. Peru's Potosi and Mexico's Zacatecas became wealthy mining centers with opulent churches and a luxury way of life for some. As one viceroy of Peru commented, it was not silver that was sent to Spain, but the blood and sweat of Indians. Mining labor was provided by a variety of workers. The early use of Native American slaves and encomienda workers in the 16th century gradually was replaced by a system of labor drafts. By 1572, the mining Mita in Peru was providing about 13,000 workers a year to Potosi alone. Similar labor drafts were used in Mexico. By the 17th century, the mines in both places also had large numbers of wage workers willing to brave the dangers of mining to return for the good wages. Although indigenous methods were used at first, most mining techniques were European in origin. After 1580, mining silver depended on process of amalgamation, which mercury to extract the I think there's a typo here. They're missing the word used, so I'm going to read it as if it was there, which used mercury to extract the silver from the ore-bearing rock. The Spanish discovery of a mountain of mercury at Huancavelica in Peru aided American silver production. Potosi and Huancavelica became the great marriage of Peru and the basis of silver production in South America. According to Spanish law, all subsoil rights belonged to the crown, but the mines and processing plants were owned by individuals who were permitted to extract the silver in return for paying 1/5 of production to the government, which also profited from its monopoly on the mercury needed to produce the silver, figure 19.6. Mining stimulated many other aspects of the economy, even in areas far removed from the mines. Workers had to be fed, and the mines supplied. In Mexico, where most of the mines were located beyond the area of settled pre-conquest populations, large Spanish-style farms developed to raise cattle, sheep, and wheat. The Peruvian mines, high in the Andes, were supplied from distant regions with mercury, mules, food, clothing, and even cocoa leaves used to deaden hunger and make the work at high altitudes less painful. From Spain's perspective, mining was the heart of colonial economy. Haciendas and villages. Spanish America remained predominantly an agrarian economy, and wherever large sedentary populations lived, indigenous communal agriculture of traditional crops continued. As productions dwindled, Spanish ranches and farms began to emerge. The colonists, faced with declining indigenous populations, also found land ownership more attractive. Family-owned rural estates, which produced grains, grapes, and livestock, developed throughout the central areas of Spanish America. Most of the labor force on these estates came from Native Americans who had left the communities and from people of mixed Native American and European heritage. These rural estates, or haciendas, I'm going to say haciendas, it's spelled Haciendas, providing primarily for consumers in America, became the basis of wealth and power for the local aristocracy in many regions. Although some plantation crops, such as sugar and later cocoa, were exported to Europe from Spanish America, they made only a small fraction of the value of the exports in comparison with silver. In some regions where Native American communities continued to hold traditional farming lands, an epidemic competition between haciendas and village communities emerged. Industry and commerce. In areas such as Ecuador, New Spain, and Peru, sheep raising led to the development of small textile sweet shops where common cloth was produced, usually by women. America became self-sufficient for its basic foods and material goods and looked to Europe only for luxury items not locally available. Still, from Spain's perspective and that of the larger world economy taking shape in the early modern centuries, the American kingdoms had a silver heart, and the whole Spanish commercial system was organized around that fact. Spain allowed only Spaniards to trade with America and imposed tight restrictions. All American trade from Spain after the mid-16th century passed through the city of Seville, spelled Seville, and, later on, through the nearby port of Cadiz. A board of trade in Seville controlled all commerce with America. Registered ships and passengers kept charts and collected taxes. It often worked in conjunction with Merchant Guild or Consolado in Seville that controlled goods shipped to America and handled much of the silver received in return. Linked to bridges in Mexico City and Lima, the consulados kept tight control over the trade and were able to keep prices high in the colonies. Other Europeans looked on the West Indies trade with envy. To discourage foreign rivals and pirates, the Spanish eventually worked out a convoy system in which two fleets sailed annually from Spain, traded their goods for precious metals, and then met at Havana, Cuba, before returning to Spain.